Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for episode 5 of season 5 of the Revise and Resubmit podcast. I'm Dr. Kim Bissell, the Southern Progress Endowed Professor in Magazine Journalism and the Associate Dean for Research in the College of Communication and Information Sciences at the University of Alabama.
And I'm Dr. Annalisa Bowen, an Assistant Professor in the Department of Communication Studies, also at the University of Alabama. And we both work in the Institute for Communication and Information Research, or the ICIR, at UA. All right, so Kim, here's my question of the day. What is the percentage of time that you have had a conversation where you've thought, I just need to vent, work through a situation, chatter, and then the person that you're talking to is like, ooh, I've got a solution for you. And you're like, didn't ask for a solution. Shh, just wanted to talk.
Goodness, percentage of the time, a lot of the time, I definitely feel like if there's something that I want to vent about or talk, I guess, think through a situation, I want to be the only human talking. And I want somebody to sit there quietly and listen. And then maybe the next day, that person can talk to me about a solution. But I think there's definitely value in having an opportunity to vent uninterrupted.
I mean, that happens all the time. And now I'm like trying to think, like, how much do I do? Like, I probably need to stop and not talk as much. But I mean, I think it's like we want to help. And so it's challenging not to try to find solutions. And here's the even bigger question. Like, if we could have some evidence that tells us how to be a better communicator, like, wouldn't we jump at that chance to learn? I think yes.
I think yes, too, although I still place a lot of value in venting. But this is what our next guest is going to talk to us about because this is what he studies. Dr. Josh Pederson is an associate professor in the Department of Communication Studies, and he studies interpersonal communication and how he has videoed partner conversation and even witnessed some arguments.
Yikes. He's going to tell us also about support gaps. And don't worry, we're not going to like spoil that yet. If you haven't heard that term before, I hadn't heard that term before. Don't worry, keep listening. And we want to welcome Dr. Josh Pederson to the podcast.
Welcome, Josh. Thank you so much for joining us today, Josh. We are thrilled to be able to catch up with you today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
All right, Josh, we're going to get into things relatively quickly with a couple quick questions. So first question is, where are you from?
Lakeville, Minnesota. It's a suburb of Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Okay, so you're already making me cold.
Right. Yep. It's
assumption.
Yeah, definitely a different kind of climate than here in Alabama.
Okay, and what do you do now?
Well, I'm an associate professor of communication studies in the College of Communication and Information Sciences here at the University of Alabama.
Roll Tide.
Roll Tide.
So, Josh, you're a professor now, but what did the young Josh see himself doing? Did you always think, I'm going to be a professor and I'll be doing teaching and research? What did you want to be when you were growing up?
That's a great question. Like a lot of children, I, had fantastical dreams of being a professional baseball player, a police officer, like just lots of different kinds of things that, you see a lot of times, in cartoons and other shows and whatnot, and watching baseball a lot. So, those kinds of things, but I quickly realized that probably wasn't for me. But I always knew that I liked working with people because I always enjoyed talking with people, meeting with people. I'd talk with random strangers in the grocery store and whatnot. And so I just felt like, how can I have a job where I get to be around people and talk with them and maybe share something a little bit that I know. And so going through college, I was trying to figure out kind of like, what does that look like? And I had some great mentors and faculty mentors. And my faculty advisor at undergrad said, hey, have you ever thought about graduate school? And I was like, I have no idea what that is. And so, and so I was like, okay. And once I learned more about it, I was actually for a while deciding between graduate school and seminary as a kind of vocation. And so ended up kind of processing through that and choosing to go to graduate school. And it was, and from there on, just have really found my passion for, teaching and research. And I think those two things that I get to do that, I just feel really fortunate about, having a job where I can get paid to do things that I really like to do. So yeah, that's kind of the short version of the journey.
So how did you get to communication studies? Was that something
Right.
from undergrad, or one day where you like, I like to talk to people? Communication studies.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was partly that I enjoyed talking with people, and I think that was part of it. And I was like, okay, well, what kind of majors can you study about how you talk with people? And I was like, well, communication is probably the one. I looked at psychology too, of course, a little bit, and some other things too. But I think what really got me into pursuing communication studies was I was on our competitive speech team in high school, and I think that was part of it too, kind of getting immersed in that culture and in that community, and realizing like I liked the idea of talking not just with people interpersonally, but in front of a group of people. I felt comfortable with that. I liked doing it, which for a lot of people is like, whoa, why would you want to do that? That's scary. So when I was looking at undergraduate schools, I was looking for schools that were smaller, because I was kind of on that liberal arts kind of mindset, small liberal arts school. But a lot of those schools didn't have communication studies programs.
Mm-hmm.
They were either kind of something embedded in English or other things like that. But when I found the school that I really liked, and I realized that they also had a communication studies department, of course it was combined with a theater department, but still, it was a specific undergraduate degree that you could get in communication. I was like, all right, this is it. This is for me. And once I started taking classes, it was confirmed. I was like, yep, this is where I want to be.
Cool.
Yeah.
Oh, so we've learned about your path kind of to become a professor. And I know part of what you do, because you had mentioned it, is that you do research. So can you give us an elevator pitch of what you do?
Yeah. So broadly, I study interpersonal and relational communication, and in a lot of different contexts. But my specific focus is looking at how people communicatively make sense of and engage other people following challenging life experiences, and particularly focusing on like how we utilize personal network members in like coping and support processes. So I know that's kind of like the mouthful, but that's like the 2-sentence version. But it's really like, hey, when something goes wrong, what do people do? Well, oftentimes we seek out help from other people, right? And whether that's to vent about our problems, to get advice, to just have someone to have a shoulder to cry on, right? Like there's things that happen in our lives, like the human experience is often quite difficult. and what do we do in those circumstances? And I think a lot of it is based on how we communicate with others, and the people around us can be really influential in how those experiences then play out, how we start to recover from them, how do we deal with them and cope with them, whether that's more of a short-term acute kind of problem or more of a chronic longer term type of issue. And so that's kind of what I'm interested in studying, is how do we overcome some of these like things that make us feel sad or hurt or angry, and how do other people help us process those things?
All right. So I have a question here. So for our listener, Josh teaches research methods. I teach research methods. We all teach research methods. So all our students, right, is collecting data is important. So what I want to know is, you're talking about kind of doing research into some of these strategies. So if I have a tough time, should I go up to someone and say, I need to interview you before I decide whether you are my support person?
Interesting. Yeah. So some of the research in this area, not necessarily what I've done specifically, but there's some research that talks about how we seek out certain people for certain types of stressors that we might be dealing with, right? So you might go to a family member or a parent to talk about a financial stress that you might be having, because, those people might have gone through it before or experienced or have a different financial situation than you do or something, right? But like maybe you're going through a breakup with a romantic partner and you want to go talk to a friend about that. That's not always the case, but sometimes we have certain people that we go to for certain types of stressors because we know we have experience with them and they've provided the type of support or the amount or the quality of support that we want for that particular stressor. And other times, research says that we just have a few small set of people that just provide great support all around. So we can go to them for anything, right? So you might go to a romantic partner for pretty much any kind of stressor that you might be having. And so then it becomes, well, in that moment, what are people saying and doing that are going to lead to you feeling better or worse about that particular stressor? And so we can look at particular messages that people say. We can look at how people are perceiving the quality of the message, like whether or not they thought that was a good timing to talk about it, whether they thought it was an appropriate response to how they were describing their stressor, those kinds of things. But then also, even further, we can, and this is somewhere my research lies too, is we can look at what's called a support gap. And so support gaps are really this idea of I have a stressor and I desire a certain amount of different types of support for that stressor. And if I go to you, Kim or Annalisa, with that stressor and I talk about it, and then I'm seeking maybe some emotional comfort, but all you want to do is try to solve my problem and you're giving me all this advice, but I don't really want that. I want comfort. I want support. I just want someone to listen to me. I want someone to say it's going to be okay, validate my emotions. Well, now we're creating some support gaps. You're giving me a surplus of advice or information support, and you're giving me a deficit of emotional support. I wanted a lot, but you didn't give me much. And now actually research, and this is where some of my research suggests that's actually problematic. That's what causes you to feel, doesn't make you feel any better, and it could actually make you feel worse about your stressor. And so if you can find someone that knows you well enough to know what kind of support you would really want in that situation, that can be really helpful, because then they're more likely to kind of match what you're desiring. And so that tends to lead to better outcomes when we start to match certain things. But of course, there's always complexities, right? So we've been seeing some of our findings show that surpluses in certain types of support can actually be beneficial, like esteem support, for example, is one of the findings that we've found. Like people who don't desire much esteem support, but then get a lot of it during a conversation, actually feel a lot better about the stressor they're having. And so, yeah, I mean, it's complicated, of course, because you have these kind of like broader ideas about who's a good support provider, but then you can look down at the micro level, what's happening in those messages, to really figure out, and how people are perceiving those messages, to figure out what maybe works better or worse in certain situations.
Okay, so we've entered the phase of 29 follow-up questions.
Yeah.
I have a follow-up question to all of this. So it sounds like when you are doing your research, you are talking to people, and in some cases kind of talking about pretty personal stuff. So can you tell our listeners just a little bit about how you actually conduct your research, and then like what do you do? Is there a way where you are able to kind of be less intrusive, possibly, as people are having these conversations? Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, totally. It's always a big concern, asking people to share something that's been either traumatic for them or hurtful, or just because you always run the risk of asking people to bring back thoughts and feelings that maybe they've kind of worked through already, or they've already kind of processed. And so now you're bringing back up these like negative emotions. And so that's definitely a concern. And so my goal, and I I've been doing more of this more recently, and hopefully more of it in the future, is to try to get as close to people experiencing that stressor as possible, right? So if you can get people to talk about something that's happened really recently and they're still kind of processing, that seems better to avoid some of that, like
Right, right.
triggering some of that experiences they've had in the past. But a lot of research in this area, and my own too, it relies on like survey research. And so in some ways you can help people by saying like, hey, look, this is anonymous, you're not going to be identified in any kind of way, and if we're collecting kind of an open-ended retrospective accounting of maybe what happened, let's say a relational transgression, someone did something that wronged you or hurt you, you can write about that in a way that's anonymous, and we don't know who you are. So that's
Mhm.
one way to do it. I've done some of those studies. We also ask for people's kind of just um, uh, accounts of how they've felt supported in certain circumstances, like in a survey format again, and so that again provides some of that anonymity. But the trickier thing is a project that we've been working on for a few years with my collaborators over in anthropology, is we went into people's homes and looked at how romantic partners just existed with each other, basically how they were communicating in real time. We did not
Mhm.
prompt them to talk about any kind of conversations, and during that time we were video recording their what they did, and also they were wearing a heart rate monitor, and so we could see what their bodies were doing too simultaneously with their communication. And so those kinds of studies are much more intrusive, I would say. And again, we just try to really talk with the participants ahead of time and tell them what we're going to be using the data for and how it's going to be protected. And so, yeah, it's really fun. It's interesting. I think, especially in those kind of situations, to kind of see what people do. But humans are. We're not necessarily, some people are better at acting than others, right? And so it's
Yeah,
really
for
difficult to
sure.
like put on a show for 2 hours, right? And then I think a lot of times in research, there's some research in this area too, but even if you're video recording someone, they tend to forget that they're on video camera, after like 10 minutes or something. So yeah, anyway, I
And
don't know if
so,
that answered your question, but
no,
I was
totally. But now
kind of talking about the process. Yeah.
I have to ask about the heart rate piece of it. So,
Yes.
if you've got people hooked up to heart rate monitors, are you noticing that if there's any sort of stressor or conflict? I mean, are you seeing spikes in the heart rate on both sides, or do you see if the person that is experiencing the stressor, maybe that individual's heart rate goes up, and if the other one, depending on how supportive
Yeah.
he or she is, it's just like, no, just staying at the baseline. Like,
Yeah.
can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so we're currently trying to dig into the data and figure out the best way to analyze it. But the preliminary things we've done show some really interesting things happening between people and what's happening in their bodies, right? So we have a kind of a case study of a couple who kind of gotten into a little bit of an argument about like how the husband was forgetting the names of the wife's coworkers, and so and she was like, well, we've talked about this before, like you've met them before, like how do you, like,
Oh no.
this isn't a new,
No.
so we're like, oh well, they've had this discussion before, right? So um it kind of connects to some research in like serial arguments or serial conflicts, right? And so it was interesting because what we could tell is that, like, obviously her body was kind of showing this engagement, like her heart rate was increasing, and she was kind of getting worked up. And then it got to a point where she said in the conversation, like, I'm done, like I'm just done with this, right? And then her heart rate immediately, her body was basically saying, I'm done too. And
Wow.
his started out by his body was indicating that, he wasn't really that concerned about this. It didn't seem like he was. But then when she was showing that she was getting more upset about it, his heart rate and physiology started to kind of catch up with where she was. So it was basically kind of a mirror, and it was lagging, right? And so the pattern looks almost it's not identical, but it looks very similar. It's just offset. So he was trailing behind hers. And it's really interesting to kind of think about, like, generally intuitively, like, we know that, like, when your body can, and what's happening in your body can affect how you feel and then how you might interact with other people, right? If you're super tired or if you're super hungry, you might have a shorter temper, or you might get angry with someone, or you might be frustrated, and you might express that frustration differently than if you had a full stomach or you had a good night's sleep, right? And so we
Mm.
know these things happen. It's just that we don't have a lot of, like, actual evidence of what that looks like and how they can be patterned with someone else, right? So um, there is more work that's beginning to, in the last probably 5 or 6 years, been starting to look at some of these kinds of ideas of synchrony and co-regulation and emotional regulation between people in real time, except for a lot of those studies are in labs. And so then you're prompting people to say, hey, okay, talk about a recent conflict you've had, or talk about a problem you've been having. But what we were trying to do is do that in a unprompted, more naturally occurring kind of setting. So we weren't telling people to, like, talk about a conflict. We just, that might have just happened, right? And for the most part, we didn't see a lot of, like, really big kind of blow up type arguments that you might see, like, on sitcoms or something. but but there are our ideas that, like, most, if not all, arguably, our communication is emotion laden, right? There's some emotional tenor
Yeah.
to how we interact with people. And what does that look like in terms of how our bodies might be simultaneously affecting our communication with others, and how other people's bodies might be then influencing not only our communication and responses to them, but also our bodies as well, right? How could two people's bodies be starting to get synchronized, like their heart rates synchronized in a conversation or not, right? And what does that mean? And so we're really just at the kind of the tip of the iceberg here on this, and we're hoping to, over the next year or so, really dig in and try to figure out ways that we can kind of explain it, because it is pretty complicated.
Well, I am not a participant in this study, but I feel like I've had that exact conversation.
Yeah.
This feels familiar.
Yeah.
Let me ask you about something you said a little bit earlier. So
Sure.
I've seen some, like, on social media more recently, I have seen some boundary notifications, like, in text, where people are saying, like, hey, I'm sharing this, but I don't need advice. Please don't give me any, which I think is really
Yeah.
interesting. Like, that takes some self-awareness and probably experience and assertiveness.
Hmm.
Have you looked into those types of things?
That's a great question, Elisa. And that's something I've been thinking about, and some of my collaborators have been thinking about. Like, I don't have any of my own studies that have looked at this question yet, but
Yep.
it's definitely been on my radar in terms of, can we improve, especially when talking about the support gaps
Mm-hmm.
kind of concept that I talked about earlier. What if you just told someone, hey, this is exactly what I want, and that other person was then able to match that because they knew what you were expecting or desiring, right? And I think that theoretically we would say that if the support provider is then able to kind of match your desires, then we would expect better outcomes. And so sometimes people just don't know what you want, right? If you
Right.
tell them, like, hey, I just want advice, I just want someone to cry, a shoulder to cry on, whatever it might be, then I think that could be helpful. And I've kind of hinted at that a couple times in some of my papers by saying, like, hey, if you want to apply this, like,
Mm.
maybe you should be willing to kind of talk about what you need
Mm-hmm.
before talking about what the problem actually is, or the stressor is. And so if you're seeing people doing this online, that could be a great place to study it, because it's your people are articulating those expectations, desires, in some ways publicly or privately, and I think that would be a great place to look for it.
Okay, so I have another follow-up question.
Yeah.
So what I'm wondering is, I mean, you had mentioned earlier that if an individual in a relationship is having a stressor and kind of seeking support from whomever the partner or identified other is. Have you ever experienced or observed a situation where the people may be looking for support from you as the researcher, and you're supposed to be removed as the researcher?
Mhm.
Have you ever found yourself in this situation where it's like, oh, I need help from you, validation or anything like that?
Yeah, yeah. So this usually, so most of the studies I've done, I have tried to like stay kind of out of it, right? And I usually say like, hey, we're just here to observe you talking with your partner, or something like that. Or in one of the studies, I had people in a lab basically, and they were just the only two people in the lab, and I was outside, and basically they just talked until the timer ran out, or they kind of exhausted the topic. And then so I wasn't even there for them to like kind of say, hey, what is this, okay, can we, or that kind of stuff. But in one of the studies I interviewed parents and children kind of about looking at kind of how do they talk about dealing with bullies, right? And so
Oh,
in
yeah.
those circumstances, oftentimes the parents would kind of be like, well, like, what do you recommend? Like, how should we be talking about this? Or like, is it okay if I tell my child to do this or that? And I'm usually like, well, um, I'm not gonna be the one that tell you how to parent. I'm just trying to learn about the different ways people approach this, because I want to know like what are the different ways people try to navigate this situation, right? And so I usually try to like be I guess diplomatic about it, and try to be like, you're not I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just not saying whether you're, because there's no right or wrong. It's just I just want to know your experience. And so I just try to keep it like that, to say like, hey, I'm just here to learn and observe. And so, but yeah, it can be difficult, especially if you hear a parent you know saying something that I personally probably wouldn't do as a parent. Then it's kind of hard to be like, oh, I don't want to. So yeah, you do have those kind of circumstances. And I think you know I think that's just part of that setup process at the beginning of any kind of research study. When you're talking with human subjects, participants, you want to try to create that rapport so that they understand that what you're there for and what your purpose is. And then I think people usually aren't going to be coming to you necessarily for advice or support. But yeah, it does happen.
So kind of similarly, like you're an expert, like you've got not only all the knowledge from reading other people's research, but like you've done the research and you've learned so much. Do you suggest like what are good strategies? Should this be happening in kindergarten, where people are taught, like teachers or the little kiddos
Mhm.
are taught about communication? Where does that happen how do you share your research? That's what I'm asking.
Yeah. You're right. I mean, I obviously, talking with students in classes that I teach is one way to kind of share the research and the understanding that we have. We a few years ago we tried to apply for a grant that was going to involve a kind of a training program in schools to help students navigate bullying situations. And a lot of it was kind of connected to other types of programs that exist now that really kind of focus on like mindfulness and empathy and perspective taking. And I think those are really good places to do that. I think I don't think school systems should shy away from offering those types of learning opportunities for students. I would be more than happy to do something like that in the future if I could find time and or just to do that. But I think some of it, if it's so that could be one place, right? I think parents who are able to maybe take similar types of workshops and trainings about like how do you talk to your kids about dealing with stress that they have, or how do you talk to your kids about how they should cope when someone hurts their feelings, right? And so how do we teach our children and socialize them to understand what a kind of healthy coping or response looks like, Sometimes you can just model that, right? If you have a stressor, and how do you respond, right? I think a lot of it does come back to like developing listening skills. We want to be able to, I think one of the biggest things that I see in terms of support and comfort and coping, it really comes back to, are you able to kind of really listen to what a person's going through? And then rather than always jumping in with solutions, I think starting with advice is usually not a good strategy. It's usually, it's the research, and research shows this too, right? People don't like to have their problem solved right at the first thing. What they want is to be validated. So validation is a really important part of this. So listening and validating, and then whether it's, you can kind of, this is situational and relational, relationally situated, but then it evolves into like, emotional or esteem support mixed with some advice, perhaps, if that's what they're wanting. But yeah, like teaching it, I think should and could happen in lots of different venues. But I think the school programs that exist that are working on helping students kind of process their emotions, thinking about different ways of kind of positive responses to when they feel hurt or wronged, I think are valuable and should be continued, if not expanded.
Cool.
Yeah.
It's hard to believe that we are already at the rapid fire part 2 section of this podcast.
That's great.
It's been so fascinating. But now we're going to shift gears and go back to kind of lighter topics.
Sure.
We want to make sure that we get a few recommendations from you
Sure.
before this is all over. So what is either your favorite TV show, or what are you watching right now that we all need to be watching?
Yeah, I'll do rapid fire both quickly. So my partner Sarah and I, when we first started dating, we got together on the nights The Office was airing, and so we would watch The Office together, and like that was one of the first shows that we just bonded over, and it was we each already really enjoyed that show, so I think it probably rises to our top of like, the favorite shows. But then a recent show that I've watched that I really got hooked into was Severance on Apple TV.
Yeah.
And I'm really into that kind of like sci-fi, but then also the human element of like, how do we help each other in a situation that's like really strange? And so, yeah, it's a great show.
Okay, if your life was a reality TV show, what would it be?
Oh man, that's a good one.
Or what would you want it to be?
Oh yeah, okay. So I stumbled across this reality TV show where it's one of those kind of like on what's the house channel? What's the one where
HGTV?
Yeah, HGTV. It's like an HGTV show where they totally remodel someone's backyard, but they turn it into like a social space. Where you could like do barbecuing, and they would usually set up like a bar or some sort of like something like that for entertaining. And I'm like, man, if I could be on that show, not only for my own house, but if I could go to other people's houses and just like hang out at their like cool entertainment spaces outside, like that would be my show I'd want to be on.
I like it.
Absolutely. So what book is on your nightstand right now?
Yeah, I'm current. This is something new. I've actually been really not a good reader historically, but more recently I've actually got back into reading, and I've really enjoyed it. So my current book that I'm reading is a book by Nick Offerman, and I'm blanking on the title, but it's his most recent book about traveling to national parks and being in the outdoors, and just kind of his musings about what that means for just being a human, but also in the context of like our socio-political cultural environment in the United States. And so it's been a great read so far.
Sounds awesome.
Yeah.
And what's a movie that we all need to see right now?
Oh, a movie. Oh gosh, I don't watch a lot of movies. If you have children, I'm going to go back to a TV show. If you have children, and even if you don't have children, I highly recommend the show Bluey on Disney Plus or Disney. It's fantastic, and it's just great. They're short little episodes, but it's just they have so much fun. They're imaginative little kids, and the parents are hilarious, and it's great. It's about they're dogs. So if you're into dogs like that,
love it.
yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah, Bluey.
And last question is, if you had to commit to eating only one thing for the rest of your life, what would
Oh, cheeseburgers, hands down.
That was quick.
Yeah.
It was quick.
Yes, cheeseburgers.
That's
Yep.
also a very good answer.
Yeah.
Very
Yeah.
solid. Josh, it has been so much fun catching up with you today and learning more about the research that you do. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to talk with us.
Of course, this was great. I had a lot of fun. Thank you for the great questions. It made me think a lot, and I appreciate you having me on.
Excellent.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.